Shalom, shalom, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog, exclusively on the Synagogue News, of course, though you can find it on either YouTube or later, not live, but later on Rumble or BitChute. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are, in fact, living in biblical times. Welcome all. Very happy to have you guys here on my little news escapade for today. We got a lot of interesting things happening in our ever so chaotic world that just gets more hectic and more hectic by the day. I actually have a total of 7 articles I want to try and at least briefly show you guys. I won't read all of them. I know that for a fact, but at least 7 that I want to at least briefly show you guys. And I had to exclude a bunch of articles in choosing these 7, which is part of the reason why it's been such a problem that I've been taking such long hiatuses. But obviously, this week so far, we're 2 for 2, right? We want Monday, Wednesday, Friday. This is Wednesday. We had one on Monday. So we're doing pretty solid so far. Nonetheless, here we are here. I want to go ahead and stall for time for a moment by reminding those of you who are here to please like and share this video. Please get this out to all the different social media sites that you frequent, because of course what good is a message without an audience to hear it. Please consider subscribing if you like this podcast, or if you're a frequent flyer to this channel. If you're interested in the political content that I put out here, obviously would be very interested in that. And of course, if you are interested in helping me make this a career, you can support this channel on Patreon by going to patreon.com and finding us at the Synagogue, same name as the name here. Of course, this is the Synagogue News, but all of it is the same. Well, I guess I don't want to say team because it's only myself, but the same person, I guess, right? So it's just one single one of those. Anyways, enough stalling. Excuse me for time. I want to get to a little pre-article discussion here for a moment. And what I would like to discuss, since it's one of the things that I decided not to bring up in actual article and go in depth in, is I would like to talk about what's going on in Greece right now. And for those of you who do not know, in the country of Greece, we are currently seeing protests, actually, against the Greek government because of its want to vaccinate children. And actually, the Greek people, believe it or not, are kind of fed up with the idea that they would be vaccinating children. They very much believe that, at least a lot of them seem to believe, that this is the government encroaching on their rights as parents, trying to use their children as guinea pigs for experimental drugs that nobody actually has any idea will work or will not work, or how they will affect the human body, the human psyche, and so on and so forth. And we are actually currently seeing large protests, nothing violent, but large protests in Greece against the Greek government's overreaching vaccination policy. And the reason I wanted to discuss that is because most of these European countries, Greece included, are not particularly huge on liberty, at least not the same way that we are here in the United States, or that you might be, for example, in Great Britain, though that tradition seems to have died as of this point. But a lot of countries in Europe, countries like Greece and Italy and Switzerland and Germany and so on and so forth, they have a tradition of freedom comparative to the rest of the world. But when if you were to compare it to the United States, they do tend to be relatively statist. And it goes back to the long-held traditions of not only monarchies, but just belief in the nation state, belief in hierarchy and authority and things like that, right? Just, you have to understand that America is a very unique culture in the overemphasis that we put on liberty and freedom. And yet we are seeing reactions, even in places that don't necessarily have that strong gung-ho libertarian attitude, against this overreach of government authority in the form of quote-unquote medicine, right? And I think that's a pretty cool thing, to be honest with you. I think it's cool that we're seeing this kind of thing go on across the world, even if it's only happening in pockets, like in certain places of course, here in the States, certain places in Canada with certain pastors, and now some places in Greece. I don't know whether or not any of this is going to accomplish anything, of course, but we'll see what happens. I certainly would like it to accomplish something that would be awesome. And, we'll see, of course, like I said, what happens. Obviously, nothing's set in stone, at least from our perspective. I guess you could argue that things are set in stone from a ultimate perspective, but from our perspective, of course, nothing's set in stone. So we should absolutely be, willing to do what we can, do what we have been given the opportunity to do, politically speaking, to, push off any sort of encroachment on our liberties. And I think it's cool that in Greece, they seem to be wanting to do that. But nonetheless, with that being said, didn't want to get too deep into that, of course, because otherwise I would have just brought up the article, right? Let's go ahead and discuss a few things in regards to, just a whole bunch of news going on today. I'm going to get right into the title news, right? Namely the crises in the Caribbean. I didn't actually put the plural of crises there, but nonetheless, plural of crisis, rather. But there are 2 crises in the Caribbean just right off of our coast that are incredibly important, could be huge, could also, of course, end up being nothing burgers. Real quick, while I get my screen shared, I want to one more time say, please like and share this video. Please get us out to the different social media accounts that you frequent. Please subscribe if you have not done so. If you like this content, remember you can find us not live, but after this video is posted on Rumble or BitChute, if you want to go ahead and stick it to the man and watch this on alternative media accounts. It's just going to be the synagogue there. And yeah, let's go ahead and get right into this. Also, shalom to those who have decided to comment. Nicholas and Jamie, glad to see you guys here today. Appreciate you coming on to the program. Both Nicholas and Jamie are actually quite important to this program. I obviously did draw the original logo, but the Great Pyrenees version that is actually artistic and good, that you see in your upper left-hand corner, that was actually Jamie. And this lovely little overlay that you have here that actually includes that logo in the corner was done by good friend Nicholas. So Jamie and Nicholas are quite important to this particular show, in case anybody is interested and wants to, talk with them at all. Anyways, so first crisis in the Caribbean that we want to talk about, a relatively important one because it appears that the United States could be involved. And this is from Time Magazine, asking a question: why is a Florida-based pastor under arrest for the assassination of Haiti's president? Now, of course, I'm not necessarily saying that this person is involved, just to be clear. It's just that this is currently one of the people who seems to be being arrested and investigated by the Haitian government for the assassination of Haiti's president. Because, fun fact, the Haitian president was recently assassinated. I don't know if you knew that. Not a lot of people actually do know that, but that is actually something that that's something that's been going on recently. The president of Haiti was indeed assassinated, and the Haitian government appears to believe that this American is actually involved. Why, of course, we don't necessarily know, but we'll definitely go ahead and look in it. Now, I want you guys to know that I'm absolutely going to probably mispronounce the name of this president, simply because I don't speak their language, so I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it's French that they speak in Haiti, but nonetheless, I think if I'm pronouncing his name correct, it'd be Jovenel Moïse is how you would say it. But he was president of Haiti since 2017 until his assassination, which took place about a week ago today, actually. So it would have been the 7th of July, of course, 2021. And again, it appears that the Haitian government thinks, whether or not they think the American government necessarily is involved, it appears that they think that at least Americans are involved. The party that he was a part of, just to give you a little bit of background on Moise, so you guys have a little bit of an idea as to the political situation there. Because, of course, you're not going to become an expert in Haitian politics overnight, but it is important because it's literally right off the coast. In fact, if any of you guys live in the South or in Texas, this is an event happening relatively close to you, right? But nonetheless, he is, and again, I'm going to mispronounce everything here, so I apologize, but he is a member of a party that is known as, I think, Tetkale is how you pronounce it. It's Tetkale. Tetkale is how I'm saying it here. Which is considered to be what you might call conservative liberalism, which is kind of a weird thing to hear from an American perspective. But the best way to put it would be neocons in America. Your George Bush, Jeb Bush, Mitt Romney types, right? Your sort of mainstream Republican Party kind of people tend to be more traditional on things that are social in nature, but tend to be big on social safety nets, and welfare and things like that. And tend to be not as big on things like nationalism or anything of that regard, right? Center right, right? Nothing too big. So this president is assassinated roughly a week ago, and now we have some people being arrested for it. And again, at least one of them appears to be an American. So let's go ahead and look into the article. It's written by Sierra Nugent. I want to go ahead and give credit where credit is due. Sierra Nugent, if you guys want to check her out on Twitter, you can certainly do so. And this article was written July 13th. So that would be yesterday. The mystery surrounding the murder of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse deepened Monday as Haitian police arrested a U.S.-based evangelical pastor, placing him at the center of a murky plot surrounding an assassination that has stunned Haitians and international observers. Police claim that Christian Emmanuel Sanon, a Haitian-born, 62-year-old who has been living in Florida for more than 2 decades, helped recruit the group of some 24 who stormed Haiti's presidential palace on July 7th and served as a middleman to the unnamed masterminds of the operation. Again, the name here is Christian Emmanuel Sanon. The gunman fatally shot President Moïse, an embattled leader mired in corruption scandals, and wounded his wife, but left without injuring any members of the presidential guard, raising suspicions about why they faced so little resistance. Which, to be fair, I don't believe that Haiti is this ridiculously wealthy country that is presenting its president with top-notch security. So while I'm sure it's difficult to assassinate their president, I'm sure that's not the same thing as like assassinating, maybe the prime minister of England or something like that. I would say the American president, but there was a guy who actually just jumped over the fence when Obama was president and waltzed up in there, and I think he punched the guard in the face and then actually ran into the White House. It's a pretty funny story, but just kind of goes to show that things aren't quite as locked down as everybody actually thinks. So you can imagine in a country like Haiti where it's not quite as strong, right? That could be even more amplified, right? Where it's not quite as secure as everybody would like to believe. But nonetheless, people are asking the question anyways. Sanon had publicly expressed a desire for political leadership in Haiti and railed against the corruption of the ruling class there. But his associates told the Associated Press that he had no intention of killing the president. Here's what to know about Sanon and the situation in Haiti. So first and foremost, who is Christian Sanon? Sanon identifies on social media as a medical doctor and Christian minister who is providing leadership for Haiti through a life of positive action and absolute integrity, end quote. Born in 1958 in Marigot, which is a town in Haiti's southern coast, Sanon, and again, I'm probably pronouncing all of these things wrong. I know nothing about the French language. But anyways, studied at university in the Dominican Republic and at the Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. There's some good English ones I can pronounce. According to the Florida Baptist Historical Society. Living on and off in Florida from at least the early 2000s. Sanan, I'm sure that's probably actually Senyan now that I'm thinking about it, but nonetheless, I'm going to continue to say Sanan until I'm actually looking that up. Sanan worked on church-related humanitarian projects and served as president of Organization Rome Haiti, which local news reports in Tampa identified as a local nonprofit that helped to send supplies to Haiti after the country's devastating 2010 earthquake, which I'm sure many of you guys remember. I was actually even incredibly young when that happened. I was only 12. But I even remember that pretty well because that was a huge natural disaster at the time, right? I'm pretty sure a couple thousand people ended up dying as a result of the earthquake there. And there was also a huge corruption scandal afterwards with numerous charities, including the Clinton Foundation. So it remained in the news for quite some time. But anyways, hundreds of thousands actually says this article. So sorry, correct me. Hundreds of thousands, not thousands. Hundreds of thousands died. But anyways, after the earthquake, which killed hundreds of thousands of people and leveled large areas of Haiti, Sanan appeared to have mounted the beginnings of a quasi-political campaign. In 2011, he posted several YouTube videos in which he criticized Haiti's government for corruption in the use of relief funds and other failures of leadership, in rebuilding the country. Quote, "If you talk to young people about hope, they laugh at you," end quote, he says in one clip. Quote, "I will bring hope to them," end quote. Sanan stopped updating his Twitter and YouTube pages in 2011, and over the next few years faced financial difficulties in Florida. Per the Miami Herald, he filed for bankruptcy in Tampa and in 2013, and has more than a dozen businesses registered in the state, most of which are now inactive. His leadership ambitions may not have ended in the 2010s, though. A Haitian University professor interviewed by the New York Times claimed that he had met Sanan twice in June, and that, quote, Sanan had said he was sent by God. He was sent on a mission of God to replace Moïse, end quote. Which, of course, is pretty interesting language, Messianic language to use about yourself. Obviously not language that we would want to endorse unless this person actually has some kind of specific mandate from God, which I just don't think that he probably has. I mean, I think it's probably very unlikely that he would possess that sort of a thing, right? But nonetheless, you do see why people might see him at least as a political rival. Now, obviously, whether or not he is actually guilty of the charges that are being brought against him here, of course, the article is not yet presented for us, and it's going to get into that. Don't get me wrong. Obviously, you can even see the title here, right? How did police allege Sanan was involved in the assassination? But the point just kind of being that you can see just initially and right out the gate why they would start suspecting him even before you start to see any sort of serious evidence, right? I do see on the chat there says, can you zoom in some? I can absolutely go ahead and do that. I'll do one more. Yeah, that's good. That's good, actually. Now, it may be interesting for people to ask, like, why are we talking about this situation in a tiny country like Haiti that is not really important in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't really have any sort of a say in the international community, so on and so forth. And the reason for that is because of the fact that this is right next door, right? This is a country that is literally a hot skip and a beat away from us. In fact, you're probably... if you live in Florida or Alabama or any of the places there in the South, you're probably closer to Haiti than you are to a majority of the rest of the country, especially when you start talking places like Washington and even more especially like Alaska, right? So this kind of stuff can absolutely have major impact on American foreign policy, not least of which can be, God forbid it devolves into anything further. Which, not that there's serious indication at the moment that it would, but if it were to devolve into anything further, of course, right, that could also impact American foreign policy even more. But just even the fact that a political leader in a country that is right next door to us was assassinated is something that is obviously going to impact our foreign policy. And especially when coupled with the fact that not this in particular, but that this is being coupled with another crisis in Cuba. that we're going to get to in just a moment after we actually finish this article, which, of course, Cuba is an area that we have much more direct involvement in as a country, and that is also closer to the Deep South than most of the rest of the nation. So how do police allege Sanan is involved in the assassination? So on Saturday, Haiti's police chief, Leon Charles, said that he believed a high-profile doctor had hired a Miami-based security firm, which had in turn hired a group made up mostly of Colombian former soldiers to carry out the operation. On Sunday, Charles identified Sanan by name and said that he had arrived in Haiti in June with political motivations, traveling on a private jet with several of the alleged perpetrators of the shooting. Charles said a Colombian suspect had told police that the group's initial mission was to protect Sanan during his time in Haiti, but that at some point the plan shifted to arresting Moïse. Excuse me. He did not specify when the plan shifted to killing the president. The police chief said the officers had raided Sanan's home in Port-au-Prince and found materials including 20 boxes of bullets, gun holsters, 4 Dominican Republic license plates, and correspondence with unidentified people involved in the operation, as well as a hat bearing the logo of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA. The perpetrators of the attack on Moïse falsely identified themselves as DEA agents per videos of the incident, and the DEA said Monday that one of its former informants had been arrested during the investigation, though the agency itself was not involved. So you can already see what I mean by if something is happening right around the corner, there's a chance that American foreign policy is involved, right? In this instance, what it appears is an American citizen and pastor, as well as a rogue member of the Drug Enforcement Agency, who appears to be helping this person impersonate a member of the Drug Enforcement Agency. At least that is the claim of Haitian police. At the moment, at least, right? We'll see what ends up happening in the near future. A Florida-based friend of Sanan told AP that the pastor had been duped by people, quote, claiming to represent the U.S. State and Justice Departments who wanted to install him as president, end quote. Sanan had believed the plan was to arrest but not kill Moïse, the friend claimed. Now, obviously, this is in and of itself an interesting thing, right? Because we know that the United States has a history of toppling foreign governments that it does not approve of. Now, I'm not, some expert by any means or even lightly familiar with Caribbean politics, unfortunately. And perhaps it's something that I as an amateur journalist and wanting to be at some point professional journalist, it's probably something that I should study up on, considering it's a foreign policy theater that is literally right next door. So I'm not sure why Americans would want to topple Moïse if they did want to topple Moïse, right? But it is interesting, of course, that we have a history of toppling foreign governments that we don't approve of, right? We have a history of assassinating political figures that we don't approve of, and especially in foreign governments. In fact, honestly, if you're a political figure that the United States doesn't approve of in a foreign country, you're more likely to get assassinated than if you're a political figure that the United States government doesn't approve of in our own country. I think that history has established that as a very certain fact. Just to name some non-controversial examples, we have the Bay of Pigs and Vietnam and the toppling of the Taliban, right? And I say non-controversial because those are examples that all of us agree the United States was absolutely involved in world building. Or toppling the Shah of Iran is another perfect example. Also putting in place the Shah of Iran in the first place. And so on and so forth. We're interested in world building. It's what we do, right? And there's even tons of even more controversial examples than that, where it's alleged that the United States has been involved, but where people have not been 100% able to prove it. Things like the assassination of Meir Kahane, the assassination of Joe Vogel, certain coups that have happened in different Middle Eastern countries, and there's too many of those really to count, but including but not limited to the assassination of Anwar Sadat, and some people even think the assassination of a former Israeli president, Shimon Peres, Shoot. Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin. But anyways, and if that's all true or not, who knows, right? Some of the stuff, like the Bay of Pigs and the Taliban, we can prove that it is true, right? Others, like the assassination of Kahana and Vogel and others like that, right? Sadat, who knows? But the point is, we do have a long history of world building, of toppling foreign figures that we don't approve of. And now we have, apparently, links to the DEA and this person claiming that there were people in the United States state and justice departments who actually wanted him to be installed as president. And of course, he himself appears to be an American citizen, if I'm understanding the article correctly, and other sources that seem to be available about this. Now, does that mean that this story is false? No, it doesn't. It's just something that I think is interesting to note when you examine the history of the United States and our foreign policy and our demeanor towards certain figures, especially considering things like we recently have seen Jeffrey Epstein and John McAfee being assassinated. It does appear that the United States government is operating prolifically, shall we say. Whether or not anybody can prove it is, of course, a different thing. But the highest echelons of commentary at this point, believe that the United States is involved in that kind of stuff. And frankly, I don't even think that the United States government cares. I think that whether or not they're doing it, they don't give any sort of a damn about whether or not you think that they're doing it. So no harm, no foul as far as they're concerned, I think. Anyways, continuing on, what is next for Haiti? By the way, you can see here Haitians demonstrating in a protest. Obviously, you can just read for yourself rather than having me poorly explain what's going on. Haitians demonstrate during a protest to denounce the draft constitutional referendum carried by the president, Jovenel Moïse, on March 28th, 2021 at Port-au-Prince in Haiti. So what's next, for Haiti? As the investigation into Moïse's assassination continues, it's unclear who will fill a massive power vacuum left in Haiti, which was already in political chaos before the president's death. And analysts warn that the country could enter an even more volatile new chapter. Can you guys see why I'm starting to talk about this, right? I mean, it's possible. I'm not predicting this. I'm not saying it's even likely. I'm just saying it is possible that this could include, things including but not limited to civil unrest or even civil war in the country, and even potentially United States involvement, which obviously can always go as far as boots on the ground. Again, it is right next door. Not saying it's going to get that bad, but it might. It's important to note that these things are going on in our neighbor countries. Anyway, several years of fierce street protest over corruption under Moïse have strained relationships between the government and the public, and increasingly powerful criminal gangs have strengthened their grip on the country, which of course is a huge problem, not only in the Caribbean, but really in all of the New World south of the United States border. It's interesting how, we as a nation, we care so much about what's going on in Iraq, when our own neighbors on this continent, Mexico, right, and Jamaica and Colombia and Haiti and so on, are just ransacked with problems. And I'm not one to advocate state building and United States getting involved in a bunch of foreign nations' affairs. But if you were going to get involved in a bunch of foreign nations' affairs, it does seem to me like you would want to help some of the countries that are literally right next door. Which is something I've been emphasizing a lot in this, if you haven't noticed, but it's true. Moïse has been ruling by decree since January 2020, so he's essentially a dictator for the last year and a half, after he refused to organize legislative elections, leaving all but 10 of Haiti's parliamentary seats unoccupied. Moïse's critics said his 5-year term should have ended in February this year, but he refused to step down, arguing that the first year of his term had been taken up by an interim government. He said his term would end in February 2022, a claim backed by the U.S., which of course adds a little bit more of a monkey wrench into this, because on one end, there's one person claiming he's backed by the U.S., but on another end, in public, it does appear that Moise himself had at least him taking power until 2022, backed by the U.S. So who knows, right? Haiti's constitution dictates that the prime minister takes power if the president is unable to carry out his duties. But 3 men now claim to be the country's rightful leader, which is obviously a recipe for absolute disaster. Moise had appointed an interim prime minister, Claude Joseph, in April, days before his death, and named a new prime minister, Ariel Henry. So obviously there's 2 of the people claiming it right there. And that's obviously a massive problem just right out the gate. The fact that you have 2 people named prime minister by the self-same leader. Meanwhile, 8 of the 10 remaining senators in the country have signed a resolution arguing that Senate leader Joseph Lambert should become interim president. And who knows, right? I mean, obviously, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be civil strife and unrest, but if you just look throughout history, one of the most surefire ways to get violence occurring in an area is vacuum of power plus multiple claimants to the throne, if you will. I know this isn't a monarchy, but the analogy still works. So you have an interim prime minister in Claude Joseph, you have a man appointed by the previous president, Ariel Henry, and you have a person elected by the Senate themselves, Joseph Lambert. And it does appear that this person, President Moise, was actually operating dictatorially for the last year and a half. So that in and of itself creates a problem, because obviously you're going to have the Senate wanting to get its power back. You're going to have a lot of vacuum in the power gap there, right? If you have a weak president killed, it's significantly less effective than if you have a strong president killed, who potentially has a good deal of charisma or a good deal of power and hold on power, right? So obviously a lot of different things that are kind of being thrown into the crock pot here to create a stew of absolute disaster in our neighbor country of Haiti. The U.S. has so far resisted a controversial call by Joseph to deploy troops to Haiti to help protect infrastructure and stabilize the country. The White House said Monday that representatives from the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and National Security Council had all met with Joseph Henry and Lambert, as well as other government officials and police, in an attempt to, quote, encourage open and constructive dialogue to reach a political accord that can enable the country to hold free and fair elections, end quote. Now, again, I want to read the first sentence there one more time so that you guys can understand why I bring this seemingly obscure story up. The U.S. so far has resisted a controversial call by Joseph, the man who has actually been elected by the Senate here. Well, no, excuse me. Was it the Senate one? No, Claude Joseph is the interim prime minister. My apologies. I got mixed up there a little bit. They have resisted the call by the interim prime minister himself, right, to actually have United States troops deployed in Haiti as a means to sort of peacemake, right? So you have apparent American links to the previous dictator who, while he doesn't appear to have been ruthless in any way, certainly was corrupt and certainly was operating dictatorially. You have seeming American links to the person arrested, who himself is an American citizen, for assassinating this dictator. You have 3 claimants to the, quote, throne, so to speak, one of which has actually called for United States troops to be deployed in the country. And you have people noting that it seems there might be political unrest in the region coming soon to a city near you, if you happen to be watching this in Haiti, which I highly doubt anybody watching this is in Haiti. However, you can obviously see why this seemingly unimportant story is actually quite important. Could potentially even be the next forever war in United States history. Obviously, we're still currently involved in the previous 2 forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, You could count the drug war too if you'd like. And a lot of people have wondered what the next candidate is going to be. A lot of people thought it might be Libya or Syria, but we just destabilized those countries. We didn't actually put very many boots on the ground. And a lot of people thought it might end up being Venezuela, but to Trump's credit, he actually did heed off members of his own administration like Pompeo and Bolton, and especially Rex Tillerson, who really were pushing for war. But, who knows? It might be Haiti. It might not be Haiti. This could end up being a nothing burger, but it's just something that I think is important to discuss because it's our neighboring country, because it appears that we might be involved on, and even speaking out of both sides of our mouths, so to speak, and because it's very likely, even if it doesn't end up happening, even if it's not something that ends up being like a 50% chance, even like a 30 or 40% chance, it's still within the realm of reason that we could end up having this be our next forever war. So it's something that I think is important to address. And it's not the only crisis going on in the Caribbean. There's a second crisis going on in the Caribbean, in the largest Caribbean nation of Cuba. This article from Newsweek by Tom O'Connor. Little did you know that in Cuba, they are actually having some unrest against the Cuban Communist government. The United States has been talking a little bit, and obviously everybody's wondered if we're going to get involved. We've been involved in the past, both in our establishing of the dictator Batista, as well as our fighting against the dictator Fidel Castro, having famous embargoes and stuff like that around Cuba. And Russia, China, and Iran have warned the U.S. must not intervene in Cuba. So not only is everybody wondering whether or not we will intervene, but certain of our enemies are actually warning that we must not intervene. What exactly does that mean? Well, of course, we're going to find out, but it is important to note that there are already war hawks who are saying that these nations smell weakness, which of course they do because Biden is a semi-sapient bowl of pudding. These nations smell weakness, and they are basically trying to bully the United States out of having influence in its own hemisphere. I believe, personally, that is bogus rhetoric, and that while we should absolutely show strength against Russia, China, and Iran, the way that we do it is not by getting ourselves involved in other nations' business unless we absolutely have to, or unless there are some circumstances that make it very, very much worth both our while and the while of the people, which very, very often is not the case. And in no American war that I can think of, with the exception of Desert Storm, was the case. Only in Desert Storm did the United States actually legitimately go out of its way to defend another nation. And I know people might want to say, well, what about the world wars? Well, we were attacked in each of the world wars, so it's a little bit different, right? But only in Desert Storm did we actually go into another nation, Kuwait, to defend that nation legitimately and then not use it as an excuse to ransack the place and basically establish ourselves as hegemonic overlords, however you actually say that word. But nonetheless, this is a situation that in itself is also heating up. And in the self-same region, the Caribbean, it is just getting relatively hectic. And of course, Cuba is even closer to the United States than Haiti is. So, and more politically, are more politically involved with Cuba than we are with Haiti for obvious reasons, including but not limited to Fidel Castro and his reign. But nonetheless, onto the article. Russia, China, and Iran have warned the United States that it must not intervene in Cuba after the island was rocked by major protests for which U.S. President Joe Biden has cast his support. As Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez railed against the increased aggression, quote, the increased aggression of the U.S. government, end quote, during lengthy remarks delivered to the press Tuesday in the wake of historic anti-government demonstrations alleging shortages in COVID-19 vaccines and basic humanitarian needs. His message was echoed by three powers deeply critical of Washington's foreign policy toward Havana and in many other parts of the world. In Moscow, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei I'm going to say this terribly, I'm sorry, Ryabkov, actually I might have said that right, Sergei Ryabkov, met with Cuban Ambassador Julio Garmendia Peña for a discussion earlier Tuesday in which, quote, sorry, I got to go ahead and scroll down here, in which, quote, the Russian side expressed solidarity with Cuba's government and people and promised all-round support to the efforts toward the soonest normalization of the situation, end quote, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry. What exactly does that mean? I guess I don't necessarily know, but it certainly could be interpreted to mean if the United States wanted to get involved, that Russia might actually respond in an aggressive manner. Obviously, we at one time were promised peace with Russia during the Trump administration. That did not end up being something that was pursued. Perhaps there are reasons that government officials know that us lowly peasants and plebeians are not actually privy to, that don't allow us to be friendly with Russia. I don't know. I don't really buy it. But nonetheless, that does seem to be something of note in this situation. I do see here in the comment section, Nicholas says, I can't see Biden warring against Marxism. It would be something of a plot twist, would it not, to see Biden warring against a leftist government. But then again, John F. Kennedy warred against a leftist government in Vietnam. And, he was pretty deep state and progressive. So nothing compared to what we see in the modern day, but certainly leading up to what we see in the modern day. So you never know, right? You never know. Quote, the sides expressed confidence that the situation will return to normal soon, end quote, the readout said. Quote, and stressed the inadmissibility of foreign interference and other destructive actions that are fraught with the destabilization in Cuba, end quote. Now, whether or not there's any actual military involvement in Cuba, I don't know about that. I have a feeling that Cuba is, I don't know, it's a sensitive situation in Cuba because of the fact that they are kind of friendly with Russia, and they might also be friendly with China and Iran. I guess I don't actually know that, but I don't see why they wouldn't be. All of America's enemies are friendly with each other. And that could make it a particularly sensitive situation if the United States decided to get involved in a military capacity. But will the United States get involved in some sort of political or foreign policy capacity? I mean, absolutely. I think Biden is a sniveling coward, but I do not think that Biden is just going to let other nations bully him out of his own hemisphere, right? Or let me at least put that in a way that might be more palatable to those who don't actually believe that Biden has any power here. I don't believe that Biden's handlers will allow our enemies to bully us out of our own hemisphere. One of the things about wanting to keep power is you kind of need to have your hemisphere under your control. That doesn't just include your country. It would also include things like Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean and things like that. And I just don't see the United States as being interested in letting themselves be bullied by Russia, China, or Iran in this situation. Even though I will point out, I don't actually think it's wise for the United States to be involved. I am very much against the idea that we would be going around state building, right? I think every time that it has happened in the past, it doesn't turn out very good. Whether it turns out in absolutely just horrifying wars for the local population like Iraq and Vietnam and Korea, or just completely destabilizes a region like Iran and Libya and Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. I just don't think it's wise for us to be involved in other nations' affairs. And I do very much think that, each ethnos should have the right to self-determination, to rule itself, right? The Cuban people should have the right to rule themselves without American involvement. Now, of course, I understand why America wants to be involved, right? If there's a hostile government, I'm not sure exactly the mileage Cuba is from the Florida coast, but I'm sure it's like 100 or less, right? If you have a hostile government that close to you, obviously that's a problem. You don't want that, right? And I certainly get the motivations for a country to not want a hostile nation that close to them. But I don't know. I don't know. It's a difficult thing to kind of to hash out. I do think it's more likely that we would actually put boots on the ground in Haiti than it is that we would put boots on the ground in Cuba because of the sensitivity surrounding Cuba. But nonetheless, all of this is important to note, right? Anyways, Moscow has, or was rather, excuse me, Havana's top supporter during the days of the Soviet Union, and Cuban-Russian relations remain robust today, including through mutual backing of Venezuela's socialist government, which, like Cuba, is subject to U.S. sanctions. There's that whole all of America's enemies being friends with each other, or at least friendly with each other kind of thing going on, right? And I noticed again in the live chat, Nicholas says, all of America's enemies are friendly with each other. That sums up what we see in Democrat and Republican parties, our enemies being friendly with our enemies. Yeah, basically, right? They're friendly with each other because it allows them to maintain power against their common enemy, which is the American people. And of course, the American people, unfortunately, are too ditzy to realize that, but nonetheless. China referenced that U.S. measures in its own defense of Cuba's position as Chinese Foreign Ministry Hang on, let me restart that. China referenced the U.S. measures in its own defense of Cuba's position as Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian told a press briefing Tuesday that, quote, the U.S. embargo is the root cause of Cuba's shortage of medicines and energy, end quote. And that's not actually entirely untrue. Now, it's not entirely true either, right? Because if the Cuban government was run by competent people, they certainly would suffer extremely so because of the fact that they are within our own hemisphere here, actually, not only in the New World, but in North America, right off the coast of the U.S., right? So they would still absolutely suffer tremendously with an embargo. Even countries like Russia that are immensely powerful and that are completely out of our hemisphere suffer when we place embargoes on them, right? But if there was a competent government in Cuba that actually allowed Cuban businesses to thrive, that actually allowed some level of free enterprise, of freedom of speech, of freedom of religion, didn't persecute scientists, things of that nature, information and the flow of information actually being allowed to take place and be robust, and there be good colleges and stuff like that. If these things were allowed to occur, it wouldn't be as bad, but it certainly would still be bad. So it is partially true that our embargo has a lot to do with the problems that are going on in Cuba for certain. But it is also true that their incompetence at the hands of a communist government and Fidel Castro's own dictatorship, right, also has a lot to do with the struggles going on in the country, which, of course, nations like Russia and China and Iran don't want to acknowledge because we have the same beefs with their countries. I would argue that, all things considered, I think we could ignore Putin. I understand that Putin is a ruthless dictator, and I certainly wouldn't want him ruling my country. However, when you're, when you're friendly with people like Batista and the Shah of Iran and the King of Saudi Arabia, I think you can get over Vladimir Putin, I guess is my point. But, obviously China has people in concentration camps and they're actively hostile to the United States. Iran is led by an absolutely insane zealot government. So obviously they are not people we're ever going to make peace with in the near future. Although a lot of leftists would like to see that happen. I think that would really just make us weaker over the long term. But nonetheless, get back to the article. The decades-long U.S. restrictions against trade with Cuba were condemned last month for the 29th consecutive time by the United States General Assembly in a near unanimous vote, 184-2. Zhao called on Biden to lift the sanctions, which were briefly relaxed under President Barack Obama before being reinstated by his successor, Donald Trump. Zhao also lashed out at any outside attempts to interfere in fellow communist-led Cuba. Now, I would honestly say that I don't believe we should be focusing on Cuba as much as we do. I would personally be focusing on China. I have said frequently and will say again, I think that the United States should absolutely not, we should reduce our foreign presence in a whole bunch of countries, but we should increase our foreign presence in a select few countries that I think want us there anyways, and whose armies should also be prepared. And I think those countries are Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Bhutan, the Philippines, India, and so on. Because I think that we should absolutely positively be looking out for China. We should have China fearing us in a way. And I would personally be placing embargoes on China too. I don't think that we should have anything being made in China here in the United States. But I'm somewhat of an extremist in that regard, I guess. Nobody's ever going to do anything about China. Trump was our best shot and he didn't do a damn thing. So, I know everybody wants to say, oh, well, we had the trade war. Yeah, he did, I guess. And it did a little bit. Sort of. But the thing is, if you want to pull the trigger, you got to pull the trigger, right? And what I'm saying when it comes to China is full embargo. But we'll get to that. We have some things to talk about when it comes to China. I guess I'm not 100% sure. I've already been going for almost an hour. But nonetheless, we'll get to some of that, hopefully. We'll see what happens. Quote, China firmly opposes foreign interference in Cuba's internal affairs, firmly supports what Cuba has done in fighting COVID-19, improving people's livelihood and upholding social stability, and firmly supports Cuba in exploring its development path suited to its national conditions, end quote. Zhao said, quote, I'd like to stress that China stands ready to work with Cuba to implement the important consensus of the two heads of state and is firmly committed to deepening friendly relations between the two countries, end quote. Also critical of the U.S. role was Iran, another country subject to severe sanctions lifted by Obama and then put back in place under Trump, and another one that I do think we have legitimate reason for concern with. Quote, in this situation where the United States is primarily responsible for the many problems created for the Cuban people, end quote, which I disagree with, by the way. Iranian Foreign Minister spokesperson Saeed Khatibzadeh, Saeed Khatibzadeh, told reporters Tuesday. So in this situation, quote, it is trying to appear as a supporter of the Cuban protests and has tried to interfere in the internal affairs of this country in a blatant violation of international rules, end quote. Now, I don't give any sort of credit whatsoever to international rules personally. And while I do think that the United States embargo has a lot to do with Cuba's problems, I don't think it's the primary reason. But it is important to note that this is another one of America's enemies that is coming to the defense of one of America's enemies, and who knows what Cuba could end up kicking off in the future. Iran, he said, quote, while condemning the illegal U.S. sanctions, which are an important factor in the economic hardships of the Cuban people, has condemned any interference in the internal affairs of this country and as a country facing illegal and oppressive U.S. sanctions, end quote. Now, and it's weird to say that sanctions themselves are illegal, right? Because obviously if sanctions are illegal, I don't know. I don't know what to do with that information, right? Like, am I not allowed to choose who I want to trade with? Is it illegal under these international rules to say I'd rather not trade with this person and that I want to have an embargo on this person or something like that? I don't know. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Anyways, while the U.S. is currently engaged in negotiations, albeit indirect, with Iran as part of an effort to return to the 2015 nuclear deal struck the same year by Obama in an act of treason, carried out in a historic thaw with Cold War era foe Cuba. Historic thaw, not act of treason. But whatever, I guess, eyes of the beholder, right? No plans to re-engage Havana have been announced by Washington. Biden has instead emphasized his backing for the demonstrations that took Cuba by storm, on Sunday. The president began remarks focused on his efforts to reduce gun crime Monday by, quote, recognizing the remarkable protests that are taking place in Cuba, with the Cuban people demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. Very interesting that he is acknowledging that they want freedom from an authoritarian regime at the exact same time that he wants to push forward gun control in his authoritarian regime. Anyways, back to his quote, I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long, long time, if quite frankly ever, end quote, Biden said. Quote, the United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as they assert their universal rights and we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence or attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba, end quote. He declined to say whether he was considering lifting the embargo on Cuba, and White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki reiterated the president's initial message on Tuesday. The State Department remains in the midst of a policy review of the past administration's ongoing policies towards Cuba, which Biden previously criticized on the campaign trail last September as having, quote, inflicted harm on the Cuban people and having done nothing to advance democracy and human rights, end quote. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Monday that the policy review, quote, focuses on the political and economic well-being of the Cuban people. And obviously, we're looking carefully and closely at what has just happened, what indeed is happening. And as we stated many times, at the heart of the review and at the heart of the policy that would result our democracy and human rights, he added. That's core to our efforts. That will be reflected in the policy, end quote. Sorry about the pop-ups here, my friends. Blinken also warned that it would be a grievous mistake for the Cuban regime to interpret what is happening in dozens of towns and cities across the island as the result or product of anything the United States has done, end quote. And I think that's very true. The Cuban government does need to understand that this is happening because it is oppressive, and it is happening across a lot of different countries that need to figure this out, including some Western countries that are only becoming oppressive, like Britain, France, Greece, etc. Quote, it would be a grievous mistake because it would show that they are simply not hearing the voices and will of the Cuban people, end quote, Blinken said. And by the way, Blinken's a total shill, but that doesn't mean he can't be right every now and then, and he's right here. Quote, people deeply, deeply, deeply tired of the repression that has gone on for far too long, tired of the misengagement of the Cuban economy, tired of the lack of adequate food, and of course, inadequate response to the COVID pandemic, end quote. And that ends the article here. And ends our reading today about the crises in the Caribbean. So as you can see, there are massive protests going on in Cuba. A lot of people are wondering if the United States is going to get involved. The United States is considering potentially lifting sanctions, and enemies of the United States are warning that the United States should not get involved. Just right around the corner from Cuba, in Haiti, we are seeing the assassination of the president turned dictator, which has led to 3 people currently claiming power in the power vacuum, at least one of which has called for United States troops to be deployed in the region, and both sides of which, namely the assassin, and the person assassinated, seemingly having ties to the U.S. government. So you can see a lot of pretty hectic things are going on in the Cuban area, in the Caribbean area, and they certainly are noteworthy from an American perspective. Man. So we are about to hit the hour mark. So I'm actually going to go ahead and end the show here today. Okay. There's a lot of other stuff I wanted to talk about, but frankly, I just don't think we have time. It's already 11:30 where I am, and we're about to hit the hour mark here today. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. This is just a Caribbean-centric episode. What we'll talk about on Friday, Lord willing, provided that I get this actually up on here, is we'll be talking about Turkey and Israel and some of their recent relations. We'll be talking about statues being taken down in Charlottesville. We'll be talking about communist troops in Canada and recent developments between China and Japan. And we'll talk about one thing before I leave here today, and that will be actually a man who has recently thrown his hat into the ring for governor of my state, that state being Idaho. So we will do one last article here, but we're going to push off some of the articles to Friday's episode. Those will be China and Canada, China and Taiwan and Japan, and the city of Charlottesville. And hopefully we'll have some new news to talk about there as well. But one last thing I do want to talk about before we leave, some sort of local news for myself in a way. Ammon Bundy, next governor of Idaho? I actually personally would say yes. I certainly hope so. For those of you who don't know, Ammon Bundy is an anti-government activist made popular by his father's 2014 standoff against BLM, meaning Bureau of Land Management, not Black Lives Matter agents, who were actually attempting to arrest his father and confiscate his cows because they were grazing on federal lands that the family had been ranching on for generations, actually. This made Ammon popular, and Ammon then ended up going to Oregon 2 years later, where him and his brother Ryan actually took over a federal wildlife preserve to protest the arrest of a family known as the Hammonds for grazing and for burning on their ranch, which happened to actually also be on federal territory. Well, now Ammon Bundy is throwing his hat in the ring for governor of Idaho on the Republican side after becoming popular in the state for his anti-COVID response, for supporting pastors who decided to hold church services, for having movement against the governor himself and the mayor of Boise and numerous others who were locking down, and for really just being an all-around pit bull fighting the Idaho state government, which, though not nearly at the level of California and other states like that, was surprisingly liberal, considering the red or dead nature of the state. So Ammon Bundy has thrown his hat into the ring for Idaho. And the way that the insider here words it says a lot about why I support him. And so it says, Ammon Bundy, the anti-government militant who led an armed takeover of a U.S. wildlife refuge, is running for governor in Idaho. And you notice in the way they word it here, they try to make him sound like an extremist. They call him a militant. They point out that he led an armed takeover, even though it was just a protest where they weren't actually fighting anybody. They did happen to be open carry, but guess what? You're allowed to do that in the United States of America. You can just see the way that they try to paint it. That's precisely the reason, actually, why I support Ammon Bundy, because the man is a fighter. Because the man is people think that Donald Trump is a fighter, but let me tell you what, Ammon Bundy is a man's man, is a real fighter. I disagree with him on certain things, but for the most part, we agree politically, and the dude is willing to punch somebody in the mouth, both in the political sense and, if it actually comes down to it, in the streets. And I think that is important, considering the fact that we do have a very violent left at the moment, as well as a potentially oppressive federal government. He is a Mormon, unfortunately, but beggars can't be choosers, especially in the political sphere. And he is also a transient, but I myself am a transient, so I'm not going to hold that against him too much. He has lived in Idaho for quite some time. But he's somebody I quite support. I support his ideology. I support his pit bull mentality. I support his willingness to fight. And I support his willingness to fight even if it actually gets to the point that nobody wants it to get to. Because here's the thing. There are elements of the left pushing it to that point. And God forbid Antifa and BLM actually show up in this state. We would need people who would actually stand up as leaders in this state and in the other areas to actually fight in a defense way. I would point out. A lot of people wonder, why do you support controversial groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and Ammon Bundy if you are a pacifistic kind of person, somebody who doesn't want to link yourself to far-right groups? And the answer is because And obviously, it needs to be controlled. You need to make sure you are fighting in a just way, right? But the answer is, if you are going to be pushed by rogue terroristic elements, then there are men who stand up to this sort of tyranny, who stand up to this sort of debauchery, who do so on the battlefield, both literally and metaphorically. And those men are to be commended for standing up to the violent terroristic elements that come at them. And I think Ammon Bundy is one of those people. And I'm not afraid to say that. And I'm not afraid to say that I openly support somebody who actually is out there making clear to everybody, I will fight for what I believe in. I will die on this hill. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but it's somewhat of a trend here on the Watchdog. The men that I admire, right? Tony Spell, the pastor in Louisiana who's told the United States government, no, I will preach and it doesn't matter what you have to say about it. Edward Snowden, the leaker who said, no, I will reveal the corruption of the United States government and there's nothing you can say about it. Chelsea Manning, same thing. I will reveal the corruption of the United States government. There's nothing you can say about it. Ammon Bundy fits into the same category. This is a man who is here to actually stand up for what he believes in with a backbone on his hind feet, as they like to say in the redneck country, and put a little pistol in your face, so to speak, and say, no, you move, my friend. And that is just something that I absolutely admire. So I'd like to give full endorsement of the Watchdog to Ammon Bundy for governor of the state of Idaho. And let's go ahead and read some of this article. So he announced he's running for governor as a Republican. He's an anti-government extremist known for taking part in armed standoffs with the government in both 2014 and 16. Obviously, it brings up the 2016 one here, which is a group's occupation of a federal wildlife refuge for more than a month. Actually standing off with armed federal agents. It was quite the endeavor, and I'm sure a lot of you guys even remember it. Nobody was harmed. They didn't attack anyone, and that's important to know. Well, actually, one person was harmed, but that person actually, I think, was one of their people, not one of the agents. But it is important to know it's not the same thing as Antifa, right, where they go out and burn stuff and harm people and stuff like that. It's people who are making the point, if you force our hand, we will. And that is a huge difference. That is a huge difference. Everybody needs to understand that, right? There's a difference between Japan bombing us in Pearl Harbor and us responding by declaring war in December of 1941. You know what I'm saying? But anyways, let's continue. Ammon Bundy, the anti-government activist who led the armed takeover of a national wildlife refuge in 2016, announced Saturday, this was roughly 3 weeks ago, that he's running for governor of Idaho. Quote, I'm running for governor because I am sick and tired of all this political garbage, just like you are, end quote. Bundy, who is running as a Republican, said in a campaign announcement video. I kind of wish he would run as an independent, but, perhaps he's actually making the politically expedient decision by not running as an independent because, I don't know. I like to believe we live in a country where independents and third parties can win, but maybe I got my head in the clouds. I don't know. But nonetheless, he is running as a Republican. Quote, Joe Biden and those in the deep state that control him will simply not be able to help themselves. They're going to try to take away our gun rights, freedom of religion, parental rights, and more, and further violate the Constitution in unimaginable ways, even more than they've already done, end quote, he continued. Bundy, 45, is best known for his role in armed confrontations with the U.S. government, which he alluded to in his announcement video, saying his family knew that what it's like, quote, when the federal government unlawfully attacks the people, end quote. Bundy also has 2 misdemeanor trespassing charges against him in Idaho for visits to the state house in protest of COVID-19 legislation. On one occasion, when he would not, leave the building, the police used an office chair to wheel him out while in handcuffs, the Idaho Press reported. Sorry, I laugh because I live in this state and I very much am a fan of Ammon Bundy because I'm from the state that he's from, which is Nevada. And I just love it. I love the kinds of things that he does. You know what I mean? There is one time he did actually one time do something that I thought was probably not cool, where he led a protest actually at the home of a police officer. I thought that was stepping overboard. And to be fair, I'm pretty sure acknowledged, if I remember correctly, that was stepping overboard. But again, it wasn't violent, but it was still one of those things where it was a little bit, I don't know, made me kind of uncomfortable. Don't go to a man's place of living, I think. Because, and Ammon Bundy would even agree with this, right? If you're at my house threatening my family, I mean, I got firearms. That's all I can tell you. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, what happens next is between you and God. You know what I mean? But nonetheless, outside of that, I love the protest he does, right? Like being wheeled out because you refuse to leave, because you're going to make sure that the people at the State House hear you, right? Not harming anybody, just being a nuisance. And I love it. I love it. On one occasion, when he would not leave I just read that. In August, the police barred Bundy from visiting the Capitol for 1 year, which I think that's actually about to end in about a month. You can obviously see him in the chair here, right, being wheeled out by Idaho police, who likely agree with him, by the way. I'd just like to point out Idaho police are a fairly conservative lot. So they're probably fairly annoyed with the fact that they even have to go out and arrest him in the first place. But, oh man, I love it. I love it so much. Bundy was wheeled out of the side door of the Capitol and put in an ISP car, IDPOL, which is Idaho Politics, and IDLEG, which is Idaho Legislature. In 2016, Bundy led an armed group in the takeover and occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Eastern Oregon. The occupation, which lasted more than a month, was in part a protest over the federal government's control of public lands, which is one of the things that he actually looks to get rid of. And we'll get into some of his policies here in a moment. At the time, Bundy said the armed group, which media estimates said contained up to 30 people, would not leave until the federally run land was transferred to local property owners, which they did end up giving up, obviously, before that happened, because that didn't happen. By the way, it's important to note that that's the smaller, even though it's the one that Ammon seems to be more popular for, that's the smaller of the two armed confrontations he started. The Bundy Ranch standoff, which actually his father started, but which he actually called together the armed group for. Something like 1,000 armed citizens showed up to face off with the government. And I don't know if people actually recognized the gravity of that situation when it happened. But in the year 2014, in the Bundy Ranch in Nevada, the United States came one shot away from a second American Civil War. I don't know if you guys know that. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. And I understand the gravity of that. I do still support Ammon Bundy anyways, because I think that he was in the right there. And I'm glad that the United States government backed down from that, because I don't think that he should have. I think that his side was completely and totally in the right, and they needed to stand their ground. So I'm glad the United States did, and I'll even give credit to the Obama administration for doing that. But I mean, we were so close to a war. It was kind of terrifying, right? Because obviously, as much as I support the Bundys, I don't want civil war, right? I'm very much on the pacifistic side of things. Obviously, when war has to be had, war has to be had. So do it and do it well. But it was one of those things where it's like, you know, as much as I support this group, I wasn't a praying man at the time, but if I was, I'm definitely on the praying side of, hey, let's not have this happen, right? But man, it was just a super intense situation, and Ammon Bundy got 1,000 armed men, many of which were from Idaho. That's why he ended up moving here. To show up at that point and stand their ground against the United States government. And here's the thing, they were in the right. They were in the right. Scary situation, a situation where you hope and pray that it doesn't escalate, but at the same time, only one side can actually back down because the other side is justified, right? And I won't go into a full explanation as to what happened in the Bundy Ranch, but to make a long story short, like I said earlier, the federal government was confiscating Clive Bundy's cows and land and looking to arrest him, Clive being Ammon's father, and Ammon just decided not dealing with it. And so he had a call to patriots from all across the country. And it was beautiful, but it was also terrifying. I hope you guys can understand my somewhat contradictory feelings about it. But it is interesting. They note the 2016 is the big one, right? When that 2014 one was like, we were literally just, one shot that accidentally goes off away from Second American Civil War right there. Boom. Right. Because there was something like 300 to 400 armed federal agents there as well. I mean, it was a big deal. You know what I mean? We're talking bigger than Waco, bigger than the standoff in Montana, bigger than Ruby Ridge, bigger than anything that happened with Christopher Dolan. Honestly, I don't think, bare minimum, I don't think anything as big as Bundy Ranch had happened, honestly, since 1985, at least, with the situation in Philadelphia. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but basically, I think it was in Philadelphia, but it was with some Black Power people, and they ended up literally bombing a block. But nonetheless, back to the article. After weeks of negotiations, the FBI was able to retake the refuge. More than 24 militants were charged, and one, Robert Finicium, was actually killed by police. Bundy was arrested and faced numerous charges, but was later acquitted. It was not the first time the Bundy family had made national headlines. In 2014, they took part in an armed standoff at the Nevada ranch owned by Clive Bundy, Ammon Bundy's father. The elder Bundy had spent years opposing the Bureau of Land Management and was ordered to pay the agency more than $1 million in unpaid grazing fees. After he refused to pay, federal officials came to round up his cattle that were illegally grazing on federal lands. It's important to note that the article is painting this in such a way as to make the Bundys look evil. The fact of the matter is the federal government had allowed Clive Bundy's, I believe, father or grandfather, the right to own this land, and then illegally took it back when Clive himself was owning the land, because they wanted to preserve the wildlife habitat of a turtle, and he was fighting against that throughout his life. So it's important to note, right, that the land was legitimately purchased by the Bundy family and then illegally seized back by the United States government because of a turtle. A turtle which I hope to God does stay alive, because I'm quite the animal lover. However, let's be perfectly clear, because of a turtle. So, the elder Bundy had spent years, I already read that. It resulted in an armed standoff between federal agents, the Bundys, and supporters of the family's cause. The Bundys were charged with conspiracy against federal agents, among other things, though the case ended with a mistrial. Notice the man did beat the federal government twice, 2014 and 2016. That's important to note when you consider, imagine Antifa if they were to go to trial. Do you think they'd win? Of course not. Of course not, right? As punch you in the face as Ammon Bundy is, he's very, very particular about the way he does things. He knows to make sure he's legal. He knows to make sure that the government punches first, right? And I think that's a very admirable quality in a leader, especially a leader who's going to play this kind of hardball. Because here's the thing, the razor's edge between somebody like Ammon, who I would support, and somebody like Trump, who I wouldn't, is just that, a razor's edge, in the way that you carry yourself, right? Because if you're going to be the guy who's playing general, you got to have real high character, because you're playing with people's lives in real ways in some of these instances, right? Like in the Bundy standoff, people could have died, right? So you got to be real sure that you're in the right. You got to keep people real inspired, right? And you got to make sure that you are absolutely positively not acting in a way that will have you not only accountable here on earth, but accountable before the white throne of judgment. Federal prosecutors expressed interest in revisiting the case last year, NPR reported. You probably might, some of you who watched the Watchdog last year will remember I went on a huge rant about that. and they ended up not doing it. But I was very disappointed because that was, of course, Trump's administration who was doing it. But anyways, that ends the article. So, what are some of the policies of Ammon Bundy? Because obviously that would be a big part of what would be part of what makes us want to elect him. Obviously, if you have somebody who's a fighter, but they have crap policies, then that doesn't mean anything, right? To give an example of that, assuming that he is actually legit, which there's questions as to that, I guess. But assuming that he's legit, Adam Kokesh is a fighter, right? Adam Kokesh was willing to march on the Capitol of Washington, D.C. peacefully but armed as a protest against gun control bills. Ended up getting arrested for it, I believe even illegally. But nonetheless. But that being said, Adam Kokesh's views are completely whacked, right? I would never vote for Adam Kokesh to be the governor. He's basically an anarcho-anarchist, or an anarcho-libertarian anarcho-anarchist. Like that makes any sense. He is an anarcho-libertarian, which is a policy that, while I myself have very anti-government leanings, is far too extreme. Far too extreme in its what would you call that? Ideology, I guess. But nonetheless, what are some of the things that Ammon Bundy has been talking about? So first off, he has been talking about eliminating property tax in the state of Idaho, which is something that I think would be incredibly cool. He's also talked about eliminating income tax in the state of Idaho, which is something that I think would be incredibly cool. But it does obviously raise the question as to how the state of Idaho would end up paying for most of its bills. His suggestion to actually have that happen, for one, has been decreasing the government wherever it can be decreased. And number two, he wants to actually create what is known as the consumption tax, which is a tax on it kind of like a sales tax, but basically on the actual product that you consume rather than the product that you actually purchase. And a lot of people think that tends to make more sense. But it would be significantly reducing the taxes that you would have to have here in the state of Idaho by eliminating both the state income tax and the state property tax. He also wants to seize federal lands in the state of Idaho, which I am 100% okay with. I'm not opposed to the idea of having national parks, but I'm not opposed to the idea of having parks for nature, natural parks, let me say that. But I am opposed to them being run by the federal government. I think the federal government basically corrupts absolutely everything that it touches. So that is an incredibly cool thing, I think. He has advocated for turning the state of Idaho into a general sanctuary state for gun rights, which of course is a really cool thing. One thing I do kind of disagree with him on is he is sympathetic, I guess is the best way to put it, to the illegal immigrant problem. Now, I have sympathies with illegal immigrants as well, especially since I consider them mostly to be refugees, considering how messed up Mexico currently is. But at the same time, I don't know. Perhaps I have a little bit more of a right-wing view on immigration than Ammon Bundy does. But nonetheless, I respect his view on it. We have similar views in regards to police, namely that they should be localized and demilitarized, which is another big part of his campaign. He'd obviously want to end health mandates, which is a huge part of his platform. And if I remember correctly, he would want to be going after eminent domain in the state as well. So those are some of the big things with Ammon Bundy, who I 100% support as governor of Idaho. And I'd like to throw the Watchdog official endorsement behind Ammon Bundy as governor of Idaho, which will be, I guess, technically the first that the Watchdog has ever endorsed as an official news podcast or show or whatever you want to call it. So that's pretty cool. But anyways, thus endeth our program for today. So if you guys liked this show, please do like and please do share. Please consider subscribing to the Synagogue News so you can get notified every single time we go live. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday is the plan as far as going live for these podcasts. We talk frequently, obviously, about news from the conservative, and of course, I have a deeply fundamentalist Christian perspective. Talk a lot about foreign news because I think it's incredibly important. Talk a lot about very important stuff, I think. So if you want to help us here, definitely go ahead and share and subscribe. I also do post my political debates here, so that's a cool thing that you can find as well. You can also definitely, I don't know, hang on, that what I just posted was not, I think, what I was supposed to post. My apologies. That was a link to the video that we're watching right now. My apologies. You can also support us on YouTube, right? Excuse me. Support on Patreon. I have to actually grab my Patreon here because it doesn't appear that the link I have here is the right one, but nonetheless, that's perfectly fine. However, if you are interested in helping me turn this into a career and think it is worth your time, think this is information that needs to get out, you can support me on Patreon as well through this new link I'm going to give you. Ignore the previous link. And of course, I appreciate any monetary gain that you can give us here because I do aim on making apologetics and podcasting and all these different academic things that I want to do a career. So I appreciate any of that. Obviously, you guys can go ahead and find this video uploaded, not live, but later on BitChute and Rumble if you want to go ahead and contribute to alternative media and the takedown of our social media overlords, which I would certainly recommend that you do. And you can, of course, find me on any different social media. You can find me, The Synagogue, on Gab, The Synagogue on Telegram, The Synagogue on MeWe, The Synagogue on Facebook, on Twitter, on Minds, and on Parler. I am on them all. Just look up The Synagogue. You will be able to find me. I also do Christian apologetics on The Synagogue, which is the name of my original YouTube channel without the news. So if you guys have not seen that, of course, you can check that out if you're interested in my apologetics. Obviously, if you're just interested in the politics, that's fine. And lastly, but not leastly, I would like to remind you guys to be watchdogs and to ask you this question. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?